Welcome to One Book, One Coffee. I'm really glad you're here with us today. Choosing Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan is a decision not everyone would make, and that says something remarkable about you. In a world filled with endless scrolling and quick entertainment, you've chosen to invest your time in a book that challenges the mind and expands your horizons. Leviathan is a seminal work that has shaped the way we understand politics and human nature. It might surprise you to know that thinkers like Noam Chomsky have referenced Hobbes' ideas, underscoring the book's enduring relevance. Thomas Hobbes, the author, wrote Leviathan during a tumultuous period in England's history, driven by the chaos of the English Civil War and his own experiences with political instability. His wariness of conflict and desire for order are imbued in every page of this monumental work. Now, a quick note before we dive in. This is a detailed, chapter-by-chapter walkthrough, so it's going to be a longer session. Take your time with it. There's no rush. If you need to step away, save this video to your watch later or forward the link to yourself on WhatsApp so you can pick up right where you left off. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's walk through this book together, chapter by chapter, idea by idea. Let's begin. The mechanics of political order. Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher who lived through the English Civil War, a time of immense political turmoil. His experiences during this period drove him to explore the nature of society and governance, culminating in the writing of Leviathan. Hobbes was concerned with the chaos he observed and sought to understand how a stable and peaceful society could be constructed. Picture this. It's 1651, and England has just emerged from one of the bloodiest civil wars in its history. Families have been torn apart, kings have been beheaded, and the very fabric of society seems to be unraveling. Into this chaos steps a man named Thomas Hobbes with a book that would forever change how we think about government, power, and what it means to live together as human beings. That book is Leviathan, and today, as we settle in with our coffee, we're going to explore the revolutionary foundation of Hobbes' political theory. Now imagine you're Hobbes, watching your world literally fall apart around you. The English Civil War wasn't just a political conflict. It was neighbor fighting neighbor, brother against brother, all sense of order completely shattered. Think about this. What would you conclude about human nature if you witnessed such devastation? What would you believe about our capacity for cooperation versus our tendency toward destruction? These weren't abstract philosophical questions for Hobbes. They were urgent, life-and-death realities. This is where Hobbes begins his masterpiece, with a simple but profound observation that forms the bedrock of everything that follows. He asks us to consider what life would be like without government, without laws, without any overarching authority to keep the peace. He calls this the state of nature, and here's where things get really interesting and a bit unsettling. Hobbes paints a picture of the state of nature that's far from the romantic ideal you might imagine. Forget noble savages living in harmony with the earth. Instead, picture a world where every person is essentially equal in their ability to kill or be killed. Sure, one person might be stronger than another, but even the weakest person can take down the strongest with a weapon or by forming an alliance. It's a world where everyone has a right to everything, including your life, your property, and your family. Now think about this for a moment. In such a world, how would you behave? Would you trust your neighbors? Would you invest time in building something beautiful if anyone could come and take it away? Would you plant crops if there's no guarantee you'd be around to harvest them? Hobbes argues that in this state of nature, rational people would live in constant fear, always looking over their shoulders, always ready to strike first before being struck. This leads to what might be the most famous phrase in all of political philosophy. In the state of nature, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's a devastating indictment of what happens when there's no common power to keep us all in line. But here's what's brilliant about Hobbes. He's not saying we're inherently evil. He's saying we're rational, and rational people in an anarchic situation will behave in ways that might seem terrible, but actually make perfect sense given the circumstances. Consider a modern parallel. Think about what happens during natural disasters when normal social order breaks down temporarily. We've seen it during hurricanes, earthquakes, or even during the early days of the pandemic when people hoarded toilet paper and hand sanitizer. It's not that these are bad people. They're ordinary folks making rational decisions based on fear and uncertainty. Now multiply that by 1,000 and extend it indefinitely, and you begin to understand what Hobbes is describing. But Hobbes doesn't leave us in this depressing state of nature. He's building towards something remarkable. He argues that humans, being rational creatures, would eventually realize that this perpetual state of war is terrible for everyone involved. We'd figure out that we need to find a way out of this mess, and that's where the foundation of all political authority comes from. Here's where Hobbes introduces his revolutionary idea, the social contract. Imagine a group of people in the state of nature who get together and say, "This is insane. We're all miserable, we're all afraid, and we're all worse off than we could be. What if we all agreed to give up our unlimited freedom to do whatever we want, and instead create a common power to protect us all?" It's like neighbors getting together to form a homeowners association, except instead of arguing about lawn heights, they're literally creating civilization itself. The beauty of this idea is that it makes political authority legitimate not because of divine right or ancient tradition, but because rational people would choose it. Government exists because we consent to it, because the alternative is so much worse. Think about it. Every time you follow a traffic light, pay taxes, or refrain from taking something that isn't yours, you're participating in this social contract. You're trading absolute freedom for security and the benefits of living in an ordered society. Now you might be wondering, why does Hobbes call his book Leviathan? The title comes from the biblical sea monster, a creature so powerful that nothing on earth can stand against it. For Hobbes, the state, the government we create through our social contract, must be like this Leviathan, absolutely powerful because anything less won't be strong enough to keep us from sliding back into that terrible state of nature. This is where Hobbes becomes controversial even today. He argues that once we create this sovereign power, we can't take it back. We can't say, "Well, we don't like how you're governing, so we're going to overthrow you and start over," because that would just throw us back into chaos. It's like being on a ship in a storm. You might not like the captain's decisions, but mutiny in the middle of a hurricane is probably going to make things worse for everyone. The foundation of Hobbes' political theory, then, is this stark but logical progression. Humans in a state of nature would be miserable and afraid. Rational people would choose to escape this condition by creating government, and once created, that government must be absolute to be effective. It's a theory born from witnessing the horrors of civil war, but it speaks to timeless questions about human nature, the source of political authority, and the price we pay for civilization. As we prepare to dive deeper into Hobbes' masterwork, keep this foundation in mind. Every argument that follows, every controversial claim he makes about absolute sovereignty, traces back to this fundamental insight about what happens when the social fabric completely unravels. Picture this. You're sitting in your favorite coffee shop, watching people hurry past the window, each lost in their own thoughts, their own ambitions, their own fears. What you're witnessing is exactly what fascinated Thomas Hobbes nearly 4 centuries ago when he began his groundbreaking exploration of human nature in Leviathan. Hobbes wasn't content to simply observe humanity from a distance like some detached philosopher in an ivory tower. No, he wanted to crack open the human experience like a master craftsman, examining the inner workings of a complex machine. Now think about this for a moment. When Hobbes looked at people, he saw something revolutionary for his time. He didn't see creatures blessed with divine purpose or naturally inclined toward goodness, as many of his contemporaries believed. Instead, he saw sophisticated biological machines driven by what he called motion. Every human action, every thought, every desire could be traced back to this fundamental principle of bodies in motion affecting other bodies in motion. It sounds almost mechanical, doesn't it? But here's where it gets fascinating. Hobbes argued that all human behavior springs from two basic drives, appetite and aversion. We move toward what we desire and away from what we fear or dislike. Think about your morning routine. You reach for that coffee because you have an appetite for caffeine, for warmth, for the ritual that signals the start of your day. You avoid checking certain news websites because you have an aversion to starting your day with anxiety. These aren't moral choices in Hobbes' view. They're simply the natural mechanics of human motion. But here's where Hobbes becomes truly insightful about our modern condition. He recognized that humans are fundamentally different from other animals because we can think about the future. A dog might bury a bone for later, but humans spend enormous mental energy imagining scenarios that may never happen, planning for contingencies, worrying about outcomes decades away. This capacity for what Hobbes called mental discourse is both our greatest strength and our greatest source of misery. Consider how this plays out in your own life. You're not just hungry right now, you're worried about whether you'll have enough money for groceries next month. You're not just tired today, you're anxious about whether you're saving enough for retirement. This ability to project ourselves into the future creates what Hobbes identified as a uniquely human form of suffering, a restless pursuit of power after power that only ends in death. We're never truly satisfied because we're always anticipating the next threat, the next need, the next desire. Hobbes observed something else that rings remarkably true in our social media age. He noticed that humans have an almost insatiable need for recognition, for what he called glory. We don't just want to survive or even thrive, we want others to acknowledge our worth. Think about the last time you posted something online. Were you sharing information, or were you seeking some form of validation? Hobbes would say this isn't vanity, it's human nature. We're constantly comparing ourselves to others, constantly seeking assurance that we matter, that we have value in the social hierarchy. This leads us to one of Hobbes' most uncomfortable insights about human equality. He argued that we're all fundamentally equal, not in some uplifting, everyone gets a trophy way, but in a more unsettling sense. We're equal in our vulnerability. The strongest person can be killed by the weakest if that weak person is clever enough, patient enough, or desperate enough. The smartest person can be outsmarted by someone with less intelligence but better timing. This equality of vulnerability creates what Hobbes saw as the foundation of all human conflict. Now, imagine you're in a world without laws, without police, without any governing authority. Hobbes called this the state of nature, and he painted a picture that's both terrifying and oddly familiar. In such a world, everyone has a right to everything, including other people's bodies and possessions. There's no justice or injustice, no right or wrong, only what you can take and what you can keep. Does this remind you of anything? Perhaps online comment sections where anonymity removes social constraints, or maybe certain competitive business environments where anything goes. Hobbes famously described life in this natural state as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But here's what's often misunderstood about this phrase. Hobbes wasn't saying humans are naturally evil. He was saying that without structure, without agreed-upon rules and enforcement mechanisms, even well-intentioned people will find themselves in impossible situations where cooperation becomes nearly impossible and conflict becomes inevitable. Think about a simple traffic intersection without traffic lights or stop signs. It's not that drivers are malicious, but without clear rules and enforcement, even courteous people will eventually find themselves in dangerous conflicts. Everyone wants to get where they're going. Everyone believes their journey is important, and without a system to coordinate these competing desires, chaos ensues. This is why Hobbes believed that humans naturally seek to escape the state of nature by creating what he called covenants, or agreements with one another. We give up certain freedoms in exchange for security and predictability. When you follow traffic laws, you're participating in exactly this kind of covenant. You agree to stop at red lights, even when no one is coming, because everyone's agreement to follow the same rules makes everyone safer and more free to pursue their goals. But here's the crucial insight that makes Hobbes so relevant today. These covenants only work if there's some authority powerful enough to enforce them. Without enforcement, agreements are just words, and words alone won't stop someone from taking what they want when they want it. This is why Hobbes argued that rational people will always seek to create or submit to a sovereign power strong enough to keep the peace. As we settle into our exploration of how Hobbes believed this sovereign power should work, we're really asking one of the most pressing questions of any society. How do we balance individual freedom with collective security? How do we create systems that protect us from each other without destroying what makes life worth living? These aren't just academic questions. They're the daily reality of living in a complex society where millions of people with different desires and fears somehow manage to coexist. Picture this. You're settling in with your morning coffee, steam rising from your mug, and I want to take you on a journey back to 1651. Thomas Hobbes has just published what would become one of the most influential political works ever written, and today we're diving into perhaps his most famous and controversial idea, the state of nature. Now, grab that coffee a little tighter, because Hobbes is about to paint a picture of humanity that might make you grateful for every mundane government regulation you've ever complained about. Hobbes begins with a deceptively simple question that cuts right to the heart of human existence. What would life be like without government, without laws, without any kind of organized society? Strip away all the institutions we take for granted, he says, and what do you find? His answer is both brilliant and terrifying. You find war. Not just any war, but what he calls the war of all against all. Think about that phrase for a moment. Not some against others, not the strong against the weak, but literally everyone against everyone else. Now you might be thinking, come on, people aren't that bad. And Hobbes would smile at your optimism while gently dismantling it piece by piece. He's not saying humans are evil by nature, though that's how he's often misunderstood. What he's arguing is far more subtle and, frankly, more convincing. He's saying that in a world without rules, without enforcement, without consequences, even good people will be forced to act in ways that create chaos. Here's where Hobbes gets really clever. He points out that nature has made us surprisingly equal. Sure, some people are stronger, others are smarter, but these differences aren't as dramatic as we might think. The strongest person still needs to sleep, and the smartest person can still be outwitted by a group of average folks working together. This equality, which sounds like it should be a good thing, actually becomes the root of our problems. Why? Because if we're all roughly equal, we all have roughly equal hope of getting what we want. And when resources are limited, that hope turns into competition. But competition alone doesn't create chaos. Hobbes identifies 3 specific sources of conflict that turn human interaction into a nightmare. First, there's competition for basic resources. Second, there's what he calls diffidence, which is really just a fancy word for mutual distrust and the need for security. And third, there's glory, our desire for reputation and respect. Think about how these play out in your own life. You compete for jobs, for housing, for opportunities. You lock your doors at night because you can't trust everyone. And yes, you care about what others think of you, sometimes more than you'd like to admit. Now here's where Hobbes drops his most famous bombshell. In this state of nature, he tells us, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Let that sink in for a moment. Solitary because you can't trust anyone enough to form lasting bonds. Poor because without cooperation, there's no trade, no specialization, no economic development. Nasty and brutish because violence becomes the primary way to resolve disputes. And short because, well, when everyone's fighting everyone else, people don't tend to live very long. But wait, it gets worse. In this state of nature, Hobbes argues, there's no justice or injustice, no right or wrong in any meaningful sense. There's only what you can take and what you can keep. Property rights don't exist because there's no authority to enforce them. Contracts are meaningless because there's no way to ensure they'll be honored. Even basic concepts like theft become nonsensical because nothing truly belongs to anyone. You might be wondering if Hobbes is just being dramatic, painting an unrealistically dark picture for effect. But consider some real-world examples that seem to prove his point. Think about what happens when governments collapse. Look at Somalia in the 1990s, or parts of Syria during the Civil War, or even smaller-scale examples like what happened in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, when normal authority structures temporarily broke down. When the usual rules stop applying, when there's no police, no courts, no functioning government, what tends to happen? Exactly what Hobbes predicted. People start looking out for themselves first, cooperation breaks down, and violence becomes commonplace. Or consider something as simple as internet comment sections. When people can hide behind anonymity, when there are no real consequences for bad behavior, how do they tend to act? Not exactly like angels, right? That's Hobbes' state of nature playing out in miniature every day in our digital world. But here's what makes Hobbes so fascinating. He's not throwing up his hands in despair. He's not saying this chaos is inevitable or permanent. Instead, he's laying the groundwork for his solution, which we'll explore in future chapters. He's showing us why we need government, why we need laws, why we need some kind of sovereign authority. Not because these things are perfect, but because the alternative is so much worse. Think about this the next time you're stuck in traffic, following rules you didn't personally agree to, or paying taxes for services you might not directly use. Hobbes would say you're not just following arbitrary commands, you're participating in one of humanity's greatest achievements, the escape from the state of nature. Every traffic light, every contract, every police officer represents our collective decision to trade some of our natural freedom for security and cooperation. The brilliance of Hobbes' argument lies not in its pessimism, but in its realism. He's asking us to look honestly at human nature, to acknowledge our capacity for both cooperation and conflict, and to understand why we need institutions to help us be our better selves. As we move forward in our exploration of Leviathan, we'll see how Hobbes builds on this foundation to construct his vision of the social contract and sovereign power. But first, he needed to show us what we're escaping from, and why that escape is worth almost any price. So the next time you flip on a light switch, call the police, or simply walk down the street without fear, remember Hobbes and his state of nature, and maybe feel just a little bit grateful for the Leviathan that makes it all possible. Picture this, you're sitting in your favorite coffee shop, watching people go about their daily lives, and suddenly you start wondering about something pretty fundamental. Why aren't we all just constantly at each other's throats? I mean, think about it for a moment. We're all competing for the same things, aren't we? The best jobs, the nicest houses, even that last croissant behind the counter. Yet somehow, most of us manage to coexist without turning into complete savages. Thomas Hobbes had some fascinating thoughts about this very question, and what he discovered about human nature might just change how you see every interaction you have today. Now, remember where we left off in our journey through Leviathan. Hobbes had painted this rather grim picture of what he called the state of nature, where life was famously solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But here's where things get really interesting. Hobbes wasn't content to just leave us wallowing in that miserable condition. He believed there was a way out, and it all starts with what he calls the natural laws that drive humans toward peace. The first natural law, according to Hobbes, is beautifully simple yet profound. Every person should seek peace whenever possible, but when peace isn't achievable, we should defend ourselves by any means necessary. Think about this for a moment. It's like having a built-in GPS for human behavior. The default setting is always find the peaceful route. But if that road is blocked, well, then you do whatever it takes to survive. Let me paint you a picture to make this concrete. Imagine you're in a crowded subway car during rush hour. Everyone wants to get to their destination. Everyone's a bit stressed. Personal space is non-existent. Now, according to Hobbes, Your natural instinct should be to find ways to make this work peacefully. Maybe you step aside to let someone pass. Maybe you offer your seat to someone who needs it more. But if someone starts pushing aggressively or threatening you, then that peaceful approach goes out the window, and you have every right to defend yourself. It's not that you want conflict, it's that sometimes conflict chooses you. But here's where Hobbes gets really clever. He realizes that this first law, while noble, isn't enough on its own. Because how do you actually achieve peace? You can't just wish for it, right? So he gives us the second natural law, and this one is absolutely brilliant in its practicality. We should be willing to give up certain rights and freedoms, but only if others are willing to do the same. This is essentially the foundation of every contract, every agreement, every social arrangement you've ever been part of. Think about your relationship with your roommate, for instance. You both give up the right to blast music at 3 in the morning, and in return, you both get the benefit of a peaceful living situation. Or consider how we drive on the roads. We all give up the right to drive wherever we want at whatever speed we choose, and in return, we get a transportation system that actually works instead of complete chaos. What's absolutely fascinating about this second law is how it reveals something profound about human psychology. Hobbes understood that we're not naturally altruistic creatures who just love giving things up for others. No, we're fundamentally self-interested. But here's the beautiful paradox. Sometimes the most self-interested thing you can do is to limit your own self-interest. It's like that moment when you're playing a game with friends, and everyone agrees to follow the rules, even though breaking them might give you a short-term advantage. You follow the rules not because you're a saint, but because you want to keep playing the game. Now you might be thinking, this sounds great in theory, but what about all those people who cheat the system? And that's exactly the right question to ask. Hobbes was no naive idealist. He knew that there would always be people who try to take advantage of others' willingness to cooperate. This is why he insisted that these mutual agreements need to be enforceable. It's not enough for people to simply promise to behave nicely. There needs to be some kind of mechanism that ensures people actually follow through on their commitments. Consider how this plays out in modern life. When you buy something online, you're essentially entering into one of these Hobbesian contracts. You agree to pay money, the seller agrees to deliver goods. But this only works because there are systems in place, like credit card companies and review systems and legal frameworks, that make it costly for either party to break their end of the deal. Without these enforcement mechanisms, online commerce would collapse overnight. What makes Hobbes's insight so enduring is how it explains both our capacity for cooperation and our need for institutions. We're not angels who naturally want to help each other, but we're also not demons who only care about ourselves. We're something more interesting. We're strategic creatures who can learn that cooperation often serves our interests better than conflict, but only when we can trust that others will cooperate too. This brings us to one of the most important implications of these natural laws. They suggest that peace isn't just a nice ideal we should strive for, it's actually a rational strategy for getting what we want in life. When you choose to negotiate instead of fighting, when you honor your commitments even when it's inconvenient, when you give others the benefit of the doubt, you're not being weak or naive. You're being smart. You're recognizing that in a world where everyone is trying to pursue their own interests, the people who figure out how to align their interests with others will ultimately be more successful. As we wrap up this exploration of Hobbes's first two natural laws, it's worth reflecting on how relevant these ideas remain in our interconnected world. Whether we're dealing with international relations, workplace dynamics, or even family disagreements, these principles of seeking peace while maintaining the ability to defend ourselves and being willing to limit our own freedoms in exchange for mutual benefit continue to shape how we navigate the complexities of human relationships. Next time, we'll dive deeper into how these natural laws lead Hobbes to his revolutionary ideas about the social contract and the role of government in human society. Picture this. You're sitting in your favorite coffee shop, watching the gentle chaos of modern life unfold around you. People line up politely for their morning caffeine fix. Drivers stop at red lights even when no one's watching, and everyone seems to follow these invisible rules that keep society humming along smoothly. Now, have you ever wondered what would happen if all those rules just disappeared? Thomas Hobbes certainly did, and his answer in Leviathan might just change how you see every social contract you've ever entered, from your morning coffee purchase to the very government that issued your driver's license. When Hobbes wrote about the creation of Commonwealth, he wasn't just crafting political theory in some ivory tower. He was a man who had witnessed the English Civil War, who had seen what happens when the social fabric tears apart and people are left to their own devices. Imagine living through a time when neighbors turned against neighbors, when the very idea of law and order crumbled, and when life truly became what Hobbes famously called solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. From that crucible of chaos came one of the most powerful insights about human nature and political organization ever written. Think about this for a moment. What is a government really? We talk about it as this abstract entity, but Hobbes saw it as something much more visceral and immediate. To him, a commonwealth is essentially an artificial person, a kind of collective body that we all agree to create and empower. It's like we're all actors in a play, and we've decided to let one actor speak for all of us. But here's the twist that makes Hobbes so fascinating and sometimes unsettling. We don't just loan this artificial person our voices for a little while. We give up our individual power completely, surrendering our natural right to govern ourselves in exchange for protection and order. Picture a group of people stranded on a desert island. At first, everyone might try to do their own thing, gathering their own food, building their own shelter, protecting their own interests. But what happens when resources become scarce? When conflicts arise over who gets the best spot on the beach or access to fresh water? Without some agreed-upon authority, you'd likely see the strongest simply taking what they want, leaving the weaker members of the group vulnerable and afraid. Now imagine these island dwellers sitting down and saying, "Look, this isn't working. Let's all agree to give one person among us the power to make decisions for everyone. We'll all follow their rules, and in return, we'll have peace and security." That's essentially what Hobbes believes happens when we create a commonwealth. But unlike our island example, where people might retain some individual rights or the ability to change leaders, Hobbes argues for something much more absolute. Once we've made this social contract, once we've created this artificial person to represent us all, there's no taking it back. The sovereign power we create becomes absolute and indivisible. Why? Because Hobbes believed that any limitation on this power, any attempt to divide it or hedge it with conditions, would inevitably lead us right back to the chaos we were trying to escape. Consider how this plays out in our modern world. Every time you hear someone complain about government overreach, about taxes, or about regulations that seem unnecessary, you're witnessing the eternal tension that Hobbes identified. We want the benefits of organized society, the protection of laws, the infrastructure that makes modern life possible, but we also chafe against the restrictions that make these benefits possible. It's like wanting to enjoy the safety and comfort of living in a well-organized city, while simultaneously refusing to follow traffic laws or pay for public services. What makes Hobbes particularly relevant today is his unflinching realism about human nature. He doesn't assume that people are naturally good or that they'll spontaneously cooperate for the common good. Instead, he starts from the premise that people are fundamentally self-interested and that without external constraints, they'll pursue their own advantage even at the expense of others. Now, before you dismiss this as overly pessimistic, think about how we actually behave in situations where social constraints break down. Look at what happens during natural disasters when normal systems fail, or consider how people behave online when they feel anonymous and unaccountable. The genius of Hobbes's Commonwealth isn't that it assumes people will become angels once they've agreed to it. Rather, it recognizes that even selfish, fearful, ambitious people can find it in their rational self-interest to surrender some freedom in exchange for security and prosperity. It's like an insurance policy for society. You pay your premiums, in this case by giving up certain freedoms and accepting the authority of the sovereign, and in return, you're protected from the chaos that would otherwise engulf everyone. But here's where Hobbes gets really interesting, and perhaps a bit uncomfortable for modern sensibilities. He argues that once this commonwealth is created, questioning its authority or trying to limit its power actually undermines the very foundation that makes peaceful society possible. It's not that he loves tyranny or wants people to suffer under oppressive rule. Rather, he believes that the alternative, the dissolution of political authority, is always worse than even bad government. Think about this when you consider contemporary debates about democracy, authoritarianism, and political legitimacy. Hobbes would argue that our ability to have these debates at all, our capacity to disagree peacefully and work through political differences, depends entirely on the existence of that artificial person, that commonwealth that maintains order even when we disagree with its specific decisions. As we wrap up our exploration of Hobbes's vision of commonwealth, consider this. Every time you interact with any institution, from your bank to your local government, to the simple act of using money itself, you're participating in the kind of artificial construction that Hobbes described. These aren't natural phenomena but collective agreements that work only because enough people believe in them and follow the rules they establish. The next time you're sipping your coffee and watching the ordered chaos of daily life, remember that according to Hobbes, it's all held together by one of humanity's greatest inventions, the decision to create an artificial person powerful enough to keep us from destroying ourselves. Picture this. You're sitting in a coffee shop, watching the gentle chaos around you. People ordering lattes, baristas working in synchronized harmony, customers peacefully reading or chatting. Nobody's stealing each other's pastries. Nobody's fighting over the best table by the window. It's so normal, so civilized that we barely think about it. But Thomas Hobbes would have looked at this same scene and seen something absolutely miraculous. The invisible hand of sovereign power creating order from what would otherwise be complete chaos. Welcome back to our journey through Leviathan, where we're settling in with another cup of coffee to explore one of Hobbes's most crucial insights, the absolute necessity of having someone, or some institution, firmly in charge. Now, before you start thinking this sounds like a recipe for tyranny, stick with me. Hobbes isn't advocating for despotism. He's making a much more nuanced argument about why any functioning society needs what he calls a sovereign, and why that sovereign's power must be, well, absolute. Think about the last time you were in a group trying to decide where to go for dinner. Remember how that went. 5 people, 5 different opinions, and suddenly you're spending more time arguing about restaurants than you would have spent actually eating. Now multiply that by millions of people trying to coordinate everything from traffic laws to international trade. This is exactly the problem Hobbes identified in his famous State of Nature. Without someone with the final say, we're doomed to endless conflict and paralysis. But here's where Hobbes gets really interesting. He's not saying we need a sovereign because people are inherently evil or stupid. Quite the opposite. He's saying that even good, rational people will inevitably come into conflict because they have different needs, different perspectives, and different ideas about what's best. It's like being in a car with 4 people who all know how to drive, but each wants to take a different route. Without someone having the final authority to say, "We're going this way," you'll sit in the parking lot forever. The sovereign in Hobbes's vision is like the ultimate referee in the game of life. And just like in sports, the referee's authority only works if everyone agrees that their decisions are final, even when we disagree with them. Have you ever watched a soccer match where players constantly argue with the referee? It's chaos. The game falls apart. Society, Hobbes argues, works the same way. Now you might be thinking, but what if the sovereign makes terrible decisions? What if they become corrupt or tyrannical? This is where Hobbes's argument gets both brilliant and controversial. He acknowledges that yes, sovereigns can be terrible. They can make awful decisions, they can be selfish, they can abuse their power. But here's his kicker. Even a bad sovereign is better than no sovereign at all. Why? Because the alternative isn't some perfect democratic paradise. The alternative is the state of nature, where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Think about it this way. Imagine you're on a sinking ship. The captain might not be the best navigator in the world. They might even be making some questionable decisions about which direction to sail. But if everyone decides to mutiny and starts giving their own orders to the crew, what happens? The ship sinks faster. Sometimes, Hobbes suggests, unity under imperfect leadership is better than perfect chaos. This doesn't mean Hobbes is indifferent to good governance. Far from it. He spends considerable time discussing what makes a sovereign effective and beneficial. The sovereign's job isn't just to prevent chaos, it's to create the conditions where people can flourish. They need to establish and enforce laws, maintain defense against external threats, ensure justice, and promote prosperity. It's like being the conductor of an enormous orchestra, where every musician has their own idea about tempo and key signature. Here's what's fascinating about Hobbes's timing. He's writing this in the middle of the English Civil War, watching his country tear itself apart because there was no clear, undisputed authority. Imagine living through that, seeing neighbors fighting neighbors, watching the economy collapse, witnessing the breakdown of everything you considered stable and normal. From that perspective, his arguments about the necessity of sovereign power don't sound abstract or theoretical. They sound like hard-won wisdom, born from watching society collapse in real time. But let's bring this into our modern world. Think about the COVID-19 pandemic. Remember those early days when different states, different countries, even different cities were all implementing completely different policies. Some places locked down, others stayed open. Some required masks, others didn't. Some closed borders, others kept them open. The result? Confusion, conflict, and a virus that didn't respect political boundaries. You could see Hobbes's point playing out in real time. Without coordinated authority, even well-intentioned people working toward the same goal can end up undermining each other. Or consider something as mundane as traffic laws. Why do we all agree to stop at red lights? It's not because red is inherently more meaningful than green. It's because we've collectively agreed that someone needs to decide these things, and we'll follow those decisions even when we're in a hurry and there's no other traffic in sight. That's the sovereign power at work, not through force or fear, but through our recognition that coordination requires authority. The beauty of Hobbes's insight is that it's not really about politics in the narrow sense. It's about human cooperation on any scale. Every successful organization, from families to corporations to nations, has some version of sovereign authority. Someone has to have the final say, not because they're necessarily smarter or better than everyone else, but because decision-making requires decisiveness. As we wrap up this exploration of sovereign power, consider how this plays out in your own life. Where do you see the need for clear authority? Where do you see the chaos that emerges when everyone wants to be in charge? And perhaps most importantly, how do we balance our need for effective leadership with our desire for freedom and self-determination? Next time, we'll dive deeper into how Hobbes envisions this sovereign power actually working in practice, exploring the delicate balance between authority and liberty that continues to shape our political conversations today. Picture this. You're sitting at your favorite coffee shop, and someone asks you a question that stops you mid-sip. How free are you, really? It's the kind of question that seems simple on the surface, but opens up a rabbit hole deeper than Alice ever imagined. And that's exactly where Thomas Hobbes takes us in his exploration of the liberty of subjects in Leviathan. Pour yourself another cup, because we're about to dive into one of the most fascinating paradoxes of human existence: how we can be both free and bound at the same time. Hobbes starts with something that might surprise you. He doesn't begin by telling us how free we should be or painting some utopian picture of unlimited liberty. Instead, he does something much more radical. He redefines what freedom actually means. Think about this for a moment. When you hear the word liberty, what comes to mind? Maybe it's the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want. Maybe it's being left alone by the government. But Hobbes suggests we've been thinking about this all wrong. For Hobbes, liberty isn't about the absence of all constraints. It's about the absence of external impediments to motion. Imagine a river flowing downstream. The river is free to flow, not because there are no rocks or banks, but because nothing is actively blocking its path. The banks actually help define where the river can go, and the rocks create the very character that makes it a river rather than a flood. This is Hobbes's revolutionary insight. True liberty exists not in spite of structure, but because of the right kind of structure. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Hobbes argues that when we enter into a social contract and create a sovereign authority, we're not actually losing our freedom. We're trading one kind of freedom for another, much more valuable kind. Think about your daily life. You're free to drive through a red light, but you choose not to because of traffic laws. Are those laws restricting your freedom, or are they actually creating a framework within which real freedom becomes possible? Without traffic laws, the roads would be chaos, and your actual ability to get where you want to go would be severely limited. This is the genius of Hobbes's argument. He's showing us that absolute freedom and practical freedom are two completely different things. In the state of nature, you might have the theoretical right to take anything you want, but you'd spend all your time defending yourself and your possessions. You'd be free to do anything, but practically unable to do much of anything meaningful or lasting. It's like being given a blank canvas and infinite paint colors, but being told you have to paint while riding a roller coaster in a hurricane. But here's the crucial question that Hobbes grapples with: where exactly is the line between necessary constraint and tyrannical oppression? This is where his analysis becomes deeply practical and surprisingly modern. Hobbes argues that the sovereign's power, while absolute in theory, is actually quite limited in practice by its very purpose. The whole point of government is to provide security and enable human flourishing. A sovereign who destroys the very thing it's supposed to protect defeats its own reason for existing. Consider how this plays out in our modern world. Think about the ongoing debates over privacy rights and security measures. When the government monitors communications to prevent terrorism, is that protecting our liberty or destroying it? Hobbes would say it depends entirely on whether these measures actually make us more free to live our lives without fear, or whether they create a different kind of fear that makes genuine freedom impossible. Hobbes makes another fascinating point about the psychology of freedom. He observes that people often feel most constrained not by the laws that actually limit them, but by the laws they can see and understand. It's like the difference between swimming in a clear pool where you can see the bottom and swimming in murky water where you don't know what's beneath you. The uncertainty itself becomes a form of constraint. This is why Hobbes emphasizes that good laws should be clear, consistent, and publicly known. Secret laws aren't just unjust. They're counterproductive because they create anxiety that undermines the very freedom they're supposed to protect. Here's something that might surprise you about Hobbes's view of liberty. He's actually quite libertarian in certain respects. He argues that in all areas where the law is silent, people should be completely free to act as they choose. The sovereign shouldn't micromanage every aspect of human behavior. Think of it like a well-designed video game. The rules need to be clear enough to make the game playable and fair, but flexible enough to allow for creativity, strategy, and personal expression within that framework. But perhaps the most profound insight in this section is Hobbes's recognition that liberty is not just an individual concern, but a collective one. Your freedom and my freedom are interconnected in ways that aren't always obvious. When someone exercises their freedom to drive drunk, they're potentially destroying the freedom of others to travel safely. When a corporation exercises its freedom to pollute, it may be undermining everyone else's freedom to breathe clean air. This interconnectedness means that protecting liberty requires constant balancing and adjustment, not rigid adherence to abstract principles. Hobbes also touches on something that resonates deeply in our current political climate: the difference between liberty and license. License is the ability to do whatever you want without regard for consequences. Liberty is the ability to pursue your goals within a framework that respects the equal liberty of others. It's the difference between a jazz musician improvising within the structure of a song and someone just making random noise. The structure doesn't limit the musician's creativity. It makes genuine creativity possible. As we close this exploration of Hobbes's thoughts on liberty, consider this. Maybe the question isn't whether we're free, but whether we're free in ways that matter. Maybe true liberty isn't about the absence of all constraints, but about living within constraints that we've chosen because they make us more fully human. In a world where we're constantly told that any limitation on our desires is an attack on our freedom, Hobbes offers us a more mature and ultimately more liberating vision. That the highest form of liberty might just be the wisdom to choose our chains carefully, and in choosing them, to transform them into the very foundation of our freedom. Picture this. You're sitting in a busy coffee shop, watching the beautiful choreography of strangers navigating around each other, forming orderly lines, speaking in hushed tones, and generally behaving with remarkable civility. Now imagine if suddenly all the unspoken rules disappeared. What if people started cutting in line, shouting over each other, taking whatever they wanted? The peaceful cafe would transform into chaos within minutes. This is exactly what Thomas Hobbes understood about human nature, and why he dedicated so much of Leviathan to exploring the absolutely crucial role that laws and punishments play in keeping our social fabric from completely unraveling. When Hobbes writes about laws, he's not just talking about dusty legal codes gathering dust in courthouses. He's talking about the invisible architecture that holds civilization together, the framework that transforms a collection of self-interested individuals into something resembling a functioning society. Think about your morning commute for a moment. You stop at red lights even when no police officer is watching. You drive on the right side of the road, signal your turns, and generally follow thousands of tiny rules without even thinking about them. But why? What makes you follow these rules when breaking them might get you to work faster? Hobbes would tell you it's because somewhere in the back of your mind, you understand that laws aren't just suggestions. They're backed by the very real possibility of punishment. That red light isn't just a colored bulb. It's connected to a vast system of enforcement that includes traffic cameras, police officers, courts, fines, and ultimately, the power of the state to make your life very unpleasant if you consistently ignore it. This connection between rules and consequences is what Hobbes sees as the foundation of all social order. But here's where Hobbes gets really interesting. He argues that laws without teeth are essentially worthless. Imagine if speed limits existed but there were no traffic cops, no radar guns, no tickets, and no consequences for driving 100 miles per hour through a school zone. How long do you think those speed limits would be respected? Hobbes understood that human beings are remarkably good at calculating risks and benefits, and if the benefits of breaking a rule consistently outweigh the risks of getting caught and punished, most people will eventually start breaking that rule. This is why Hobbes places such enormous emphasis on the certainty and severity of punishment. He's not being cruel or vindictive, he's being practical. In his view, the threat of punishment serves as a kind of artificial conscience for society. When our natural impulses might lead us to take what we want regardless of who gets hurt, The knowledge that we'll face consequences for such actions creates a pause, a moment of reflection that often tips the scales towards civilized behavior. Now, think about this in terms of modern technology and social media. We're living through a fascinating experiment in what happens when traditional systems of social control break down or become harder to enforce. Online, people often behave in ways they would never dream of behaving in face-to-face interactions. They're cruel, dishonest, and aggressive in ways that would be unthinkable at a dinner party or in a workplace. Why? Largely because the traditional mechanisms of social punishment, shame, and consequences seem distant or non-existent in digital spaces. Hobbes would probably look at Twitter arguments and online harassment and nod knowingly, seeing them as perfect examples of what happens when the social contract becomes unclear or unenforceable. But Hobbes also understood something crucial about the relationship between laws and legitimacy. Laws can't just be arbitrary commands imposed by whoever happens to be strongest at the moment. For laws to truly work, people need to believe in the system that creates and enforces them. This is where his famous concept of the social contract becomes so important. We agree to follow laws not because we're forced to, but because we recognize that everyone following the same rules creates a world that's better for all of us than the alternative chaos would be. Consider how this plays out in something as simple as standing in line at the grocery store. There's no law that says you must wait your turn, but there's a powerful social contract at work. Everyone agrees to this system because we all recognize that the alternative, everyone pushing and shoving to get to the cashier first, would be miserable for everyone involved. The person who cuts in line faces social punishment, dirty looks, comments from other customers, and the general disapproval of the community. These informal punishments often work just as well as formal legal ones. Hobbes also recognized that the severity of punishment needs to match the severity of the crime, but more importantly, that the certainty of being caught and punished matters more than how harsh the punishment is. A parking ticket isn't particularly severe, but if you knew with absolute certainty that parking illegally would result in a ticket every single time, you'd probably never park illegally. On the other hand, if the punishment for theft was extremely harsh but you knew you'd probably never get caught, the harsh punishment wouldn't be much of a deterrent. This principle has profound implications for how we think about everything from corporate crime to international relations. When wealthy individuals or powerful corporations can break rules with little fear of meaningful consequences, the social contract begins to break down. People start to feel that the system is unfair, that there are different rules for different people, and this erosion of trust in the fairness of laws and punishments can lead to the kind of social instability that Hobbes feared most. As we wrap up our exploration of Hobbes's insights on laws and punishments, it's worth remembering that his ultimate goal wasn't to create a society ruled by fear, but rather one where the rational application of consequences creates space for human flourishing. Laws and their enforcement are like the banks of a river. They don't stop the water from flowing. They simply channel its energy in productive directions. In our next discussion, we'll explore how Hobbes believed these principles should be applied in practice, and why he thought that understanding the relationship between authority and freedom was crucial for anyone hoping to build a just and stable society. Picture this. You're sitting in your favorite coffee shop, and your friend leans across the table with that look in their eyes, you know the one, where they're about to tell you something that's going to completely change how you see the world. That's exactly what Thomas Hobbes is doing in this absolutely explosive section of Leviathan called Of the Kingdom of Darkness. And trust me, when I say explosive, I mean Hobbes is about to take a sledgehammer to some of the most sacred institutions of his time. Now think about this for a moment. We've been talking about how Hobbes wants people to escape the brutal state of nature by creating a powerful sovereign, right? Well, here's where things get really interesting and, frankly, a bit dangerous for old Thomas. He's arguing that there's another kind of chaos threatening society, and it's not coming from the absence of government. It's coming from religious institutions themselves. Hobbes calls this the kingdom of darkness, and he's not being subtle about it. Imagine you're trying to build the perfect house. You've got your blueprints, your materials, your skilled workers. But there's this other group of people running around telling everyone that the blueprints are wrong, that they should listen to invisible architects instead. And oh, by the way, the real construction site is actually in another dimension. That's essentially what Hobbes sees happening with religious authorities interfering with political power. Here's where it gets absolutely fascinating. Hobbes isn't attacking religion itself. He's way too smart for that, and frankly, it would have gotten him killed. Instead, he's going after what he sees as the manipulation and misuse of religious belief. Think about those televangelists you see on late-night television, promising miracles in exchange for donations. Hobbes would have had a field day with that kind of thing. He's essentially arguing that when religious leaders claim to have special access to divine truth that contradicts earthly authority, they're creating a competing power structure that undermines the very peace and stability that government is supposed to provide. Now, here's a story that perfectly illustrates Hobbes' point. Imagine a medieval village where the local priest tells people that God wants them to disobey the king's tax collectors because earthly wealth is sinful. Meanwhile, the king's representatives are trying to collect taxes to fund the army that protects the village from raiders. What happens? Chaos. Confusion. People don't know who to obey, and suddenly you're back to something dangerously close to that state of nature we've been trying to escape. But Hobbes goes even deeper than this. He's particularly bothered by what he calls vain philosophy, essentially, the mixing of Aristotelian metaphysics with Christian theology that was so popular in medieval universities. Picture someone trying to explain how your smartphone works by talking about the essence of electricity and the substantial forms of silicon chips. You'd probably think they were either crazy or trying to confuse you on purpose, right? That's exactly how Hobbes feels about scholars who use complicated philosophical jargon to explain religious mysteries. Here's where this becomes incredibly relevant to our modern world. Think about how conspiracy theories spread today. Someone posts a video claiming that scientists are hiding the real truth about vaccines, or that historians are covering up the actual facts about historical events. They use just enough scientific-sounding language to seem credible, but they're really undermining trust in legitimate expertise. Hobbes would recognize this pattern immediately. It's the same thing he saw happening with religious authorities who claimed special knowledge that contradicted observable reality and established institutions. The really brilliant thing about Hobbes' analysis is how he connects superstition to political instability. When people believe in ghosts, demons, and miraculous interventions, they become susceptible to manipulation by anyone claiming to have supernatural powers or knowledge. It's like that friend we all have who falls for every get-rich-quick scheme because they want to believe in magic solutions to complex problems. Except instead of losing money, entire societies can lose their peace and stability. Now think about this. Hobbes is writing in the 17th century, right in the middle of devastating religious wars that are tearing Europe apart. Catholics and Protestants are literally killing each other over theological differences, and everyone claims God is on their side. From Hobbes' perspective, this is exactly what happens when you allow competing sources of authority to exist alongside political power. It's like having two different GPS systems giving you contradictory directions while you're driving. Eventually, you're going to crash. But here's what makes Hobbes so sophisticated. He's not saying religion is inherently bad or that people shouldn't believe in God. What he's saying is that religious belief becomes dangerous when it's used to justify disobedience to legitimate political authority, or when it's deliberately made mysterious and incomprehensible to keep people dependent on priestly interpretation. Consider how this applies to our contemporary debates about expertise and authority. When people dismiss scientific consensus about climate change or public health measures, often they're doing exactly what Hobbes warned against, choosing to believe in alternative authorities who promise simpler, more appealing explanations than the complex realities that actual experts present. The kingdom of darkness, in Hobbes' view, is essentially any system that keeps people ignorant, confused, and divided when they should be united under clear, rational authority. It's the realm where fear of invisible enemies takes precedence over addressing real, tangible problems. It's where people spend more energy arguing about unprovable metaphysical claims than working together to build better societies. As we wrap up this intense journey through Hobbes' critique, remember that he's not just being a grumpy atheist picking on religion. He's making a profound argument about how societies can protect themselves from the kind of intellectual and spiritual manipulation that leads to conflict and chaos. Whether we're talking about medieval priests claiming miraculous powers or modern influencers spreading misinformation, the pattern remains remarkably consistent. And that's what makes Hobbes' insights so enduringly powerful. He's identified something fundamental about how authority, belief, and social order interact in ways that are just as relevant today as they were 3.5 centuries ago. Picture this: you've spent years building the perfect house. You've laid a solid foundation, reinforced the walls, weatherproofed the roof. But now, as you sit back with your morning coffee, you start to notice the subtle signs of decay. A crack in the foundation here, some rot in the beams there. What seemed so permanent, so unshakable, suddenly feels fragile. This is exactly what Thomas Hobbes understood about political systems, and it's what makes his analysis of how governments fall apart so chillingly relevant today. Hobbes wasn't just a philosopher sitting in an ivory tower theorizing about politics. He lived through one of the most turbulent periods in English history, witnessing firsthand the collapse of royal authority and the descent into civil war. When he wrote about the dissolution of commonwealths, he was drawing from the raw, bloody experience of watching his own society tear itself apart. And what he discovered about the vulnerabilities of political systems reads like a diagnostic manual for our own troubled times. Think about this for a moment. What makes a government legitimate in your mind? Is it the fact that you voted for your representatives, the Constitution that guarantees your rights, the police and military that enforce the laws? Hobbes would tell you that all of these things, impressive as they might seem, are actually quite fragile. They depend on something much more basic and much more vulnerable, the collective belief that the system deserves to exist. The first and most dangerous threat to any commonwealth, according to Hobbes, is what we might call ideological infection. Imagine a virus that doesn't attack the body but attacks the mind, spreading the belief that the current government has no right to rule. This is exactly what happens when people begin to believe they can pick and choose which laws to follow based on their personal conscience or religious beliefs. Now, this might sound reasonable on the surface. After all, shouldn't we follow our conscience? But Hobbes saw this as a recipe for disaster. Consider what happened in his own time when religious groups claimed their interpretation of God's will superseded the king's authority. Suddenly, you had Catholics who believed they owed allegiance to the Pope, Puritans who thought they answered only to their reading of Scripture, and various other factions each claiming divine authorization for their political views. The result wasn't religious freedom, it was chaos. Each group became a law unto itself, and the Commonwealth fractured along ideological lines. Does this sound familiar? Look around at our contemporary political landscape. We see people claiming that certain laws don't apply to them because they violate their religious beliefs, or because they conflict with their interpretation of constitutional principles, or because they believe the election was illegitimate. Whether you agree with these positions or not, Hobbes would point out the dangerous pattern. Once people start believing they have the right to determine for themselves which governmental authority is legitimate, you're on a path toward dissolution. But ideological threats aren't the only danger. Hobbes identified another insidious problem: the concentration of private power that rivals governmental authority. Think of it like this. Imagine you're the mayor of a town, but there's a wealthy corporation that employs half the population, owns most of the land, and has its own security force. Who really runs that town? This is what Hobbes called the problem of mighty subjects. Individuals or groups who accumulate so much power that they become states within the state. In Hobbes's era, this might have been a powerful duke with his own army and vast estates. Today, we might think of tech billionaires who control the flow of information, multinational corporations that can essentially dictate terms to governments, or even organized crime syndicates that create parallel systems of authority. When Amazon can effectively determine which businesses succeed or fail, when Facebook can influence elections through its algorithms, when drug cartels control entire regions. These are modern versions of the same ancient problem. The most dramatic threat Hobbes identified, though, is what happens when the sovereign power itself becomes divided. Picture a body with two heads, each trying to control the same limbs. The result isn't coordination, it's paralysis and self-destruction. This is what happens when you have competing claims to ultimate authority within the same political system. Hobbes lived through exactly this scenario during the English Civil War, when Parliament and the king both claimed supreme authority. Neither could back down without losing everything, and neither could govern effectively while the other existed. The only resolution was violent conflict until one side was completely destroyed. It's a sobering reminder that political systems, no matter how sophisticated, can face situations where peaceful resolution becomes impossible. Now, think about our own democratic systems. We pride ourselves on checks and balances, on the separation of powers that prevents any one institution from becoming too powerful. But what happens when these different branches of government begin to see each other not as legitimate partners in governance, but as existential threats? What happens when the executive branch claims the legislature is illegitimate, or when courts are dismissed as partisan actors rather than neutral arbiters? Hobbes would warn us that we're playing with fire. Democratic institutions only work when all parties accept the legitimacy of the system itself, even when they disagree with particular outcomes. Once that mutual recognition breaks down, once each side begins to view the other as an illegitimate usurper rather than a legitimate opponent, you're not far from the kind of crisis that brought down the English monarchy in Hobbes's time. Perhaps most unsettling is Hobbes's insight that these threats often work together, creating a cascade of dissolution. Economic inequality creates mighty subjects who challenge governmental authority. Ideological divisions make it easier for people to rationalize disobedience. Political polarization leads to competing claims of legitimacy. Before you know it, what seemed like a stable system is coming apart at the seams. The genius of Hobbes's analysis lies not in offering easy solutions, but in forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about the fragility of political order. As we navigate our own turbulent times, his warnings echo across the centuries, reminding us that the peace and stability we often take for granted require constant vigilance and collective commitment to maintain. So here we are, settling into that final chapter of our journey through Hobbes' mind, and I have to say, if you're still with me after all we've explored together, you've earned that extra shot of espresso. We've walked through the state of nature, witnessed the birth of the Leviathan, and examined how this massive political machine is supposed to work. But now comes the moment where Hobbes steps back, takes a deep breath, and asks the question that keeps political philosophers awake at night. How do we actually keep this whole thing from falling apart? Think about it this way. You've built the most beautiful house you can imagine. Perfect foundation, solid walls, elegant rooms. But now you have to live in it day after day, year after year. How do you maintain it? How do you keep the roof from leaking, the foundation from cracking, the whole structure from slowly deteriorating back into rubble? That's exactly what Hobbes is grappling with in his conclusion about maintaining a stable society. The first thing Hobbes reminds us, and this is crucial, is that creating the Leviathan was just the beginning. It's like getting married versus staying married, or starting a business versus keeping it profitable for decades. The initial contract, that moment when people agreed to surrender their natural rights to a sovereign power, was the easy part. The hard part is what comes next, the daily, grinding work of keeping that agreement alive and meaningful. Now, think about this for a moment. What makes you continue to follow rules when no one's watching? What keeps you from cheating on your taxes when you know you probably wouldn't get caught? Hobbes understood that fear alone couldn't be the only glue holding society together. Sure, the threat of punishment matters, but there's something deeper at work. He recognized that people need to genuinely believe in the system, to see it as legitimate, not just powerful. This is where Hobbes gets surprisingly modern. He talks about what we might today call civic education, though he wouldn't use that term. The sovereign doesn't just need swords and prisons. It needs schools and stories, rituals and reasons. People need to understand not just what they're forbidden to do, but why those prohibitions exist. They need to see themselves as part of something larger, something worth preserving. Consider how this plays out in our own time. Why do most people stop at red lights even when there's no traffic and no police around? It's not just because they might get a ticket. It's because they've internalized the idea that traffic rules make everyone safer, that the system works better when everyone follows the same basic principles. That's the kind of deep legitimacy Hobbes knew his Leviathan would need to survive. But here's where it gets really interesting. Hobbes also recognized that stability doesn't mean stagnation. A healthy society needs to be able to adapt and evolve without destroying itself in the process. Think of it like a tree that bends in strong winds rather than breaking. The sovereign needs to be strong enough to maintain order, but flexible enough to respond to changing circumstances. This creates what Hobbes saw as one of the fundamental tensions in political life. Too much rigidity, and the system becomes brittle, vulnerable to sudden shocks and revolutions. Too much flexibility, and you're back to that state of nature where everyone's fighting everyone else. It's like trying to tune a guitar string. Too loose and it won't make music, too tight and it snaps. The genius of Hobbes' insight here is that he understood this balance couldn't be achieved once and then forgotten. It requires constant attention, constant recalibration. Modern democracies actually demonstrate this beautifully. Think about how constitutional amendments work, or how the Supreme Court reinterprets laws for new situations. These are mechanisms for managed change, ways of evolving without revolution. Hobbes also spent considerable time thinking about what happens when the system starts to break down. He knew that even the mightiest Leviathan could weaken and die. Sometimes it's external pressure, like invasion or economic collapse. Sometimes it's internal decay, corruption eating away at the foundations like termites in wooden beams. And sometimes, most dangerously, it's when people simply stop believing in the system's legitimacy. We've seen this pattern repeat throughout history. The Roman Empire didn't fall in a day. It slowly lost the loyalty of its citizens and soldiers. The Soviet Union collapsed not because of military defeat, but because people stopped believing in the system's promises. Even today, we can see how trust in institutions affects political stability. When people lose faith in their government, their courts, their elections, the social contract starts to fray. But Hobbes wasn't pessimistic about this. He believed that understanding these dynamics was the first step toward preventing them. It's like a doctor who studies disease not to spread it, but to cure it. By recognizing the signs of social breakdown, by understanding what makes societies stable or unstable, we can work to strengthen the systems we depend on. This brings us to perhaps the most practical wisdom in all of Hobbes' work, the recognition that politics isn't a spectator sport. The health of the Leviathan depends on the active participation and vigilance of its citizens, not in the sense of constant revolution or protest, but in the deeper sense of civic engagement, of taking responsibility for the common good. As we close our journey through Leviathan, what strikes me most is how Hobbes managed to be both deeply pessimistic about human nature and cautiously optimistic about human potential. Yes, he believed we're naturally selfish and violent, but he also believed we're smart enough to create systems that channel those impulses toward productive ends. The Leviathan isn't just a monster, it's a masterpiece of human cooperation, a testament to our ability to transcend our worst instincts through reason and mutual agreement. So the next time you flip a light switch and electricity flows, or turn a faucet and clean water appears, or walk down a street at night without fear, remember that you're experiencing the daily miracle of the social contract. You're living inside Hobbes' Leviathan, and it's working exactly as he envisioned. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but well enough to transform the war of all against all into something approaching civilization. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan is a profound exploration of human nature, society, and governance. Hobbes presents a compelling argument for a strong, centralized authority to avoid the chaos inherent in the state of nature, a condition he famously describes as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The essence of Hobbes' philosophy underscores the importance of social contracts and the establishment of a sovereign power to ensure peace and prevent civil war. Here are some key actionable takeaways from Leviathan. 1. Recognize the necessity of compromise. Hobbes highlights the importance of yielding certain freedoms to ensure societal harmony. Practically, this means being open to negotiation and understanding in everyday interactions. Start incredibly small by practicing active listening and trying to see things from another's perspective to foster mutual respect. 2. Embrace the power of a social contract. Understand that thriving communities are built on agreed-upon norms and rules. Apply this by establishing clear boundaries and expectations in your personal and professional relationships. Be patient with yourself as you learn to communicate these effectively. 3. Value stability over chaos. Hobbes advocates for order as a foundation for prosperity. In practice, prioritize routines and structures that bring stability into your life, whether it's a morning ritual or a consistent work schedule. Remember, small steps lead to big changes. 4. Understand human nature. Hobbes provides a lens to view the motivations and behaviors of others. Use this understanding to navigate complex social dynamics, recognizing that individuals are often driven by self-preservation and fear. Approach conflict with empathy and strive for solutions that consider everyone's needs. 5. The importance of strong governance. Hobbes argues for a centralized authority to maintain peace. While this applies on a societal level, personally, it can mean taking control of your own life decisions and creating a personal government of habits and values that guide you. Start by identifying one core principle you wish to live by and build from there. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with at least one idea from this book that stuck with you, one concept you're going to carry forward. It could be something that challenged your thinking, something you want to try, or even something you disagreed with. Your insight might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. And if this summary gave you something valuable, a new perspective, a spark of motivation, or even just a peaceful hour with your coffee, share it with someone who might need it too. Subscribe to One Book, One Coffee, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new summary. Every week, we sit down together with one great book, one warm cup of coffee, and the simple belief that wisdom, shared well, can change lives. Until next time, keep reading, keep growing, and remember, every small step counts. See you at the next book.